first of all, I want to talk about Israel, because Netanyahu, the Prime Minister there, he has admitted a tragic mistake as civilians were burnt alive in a camp in Rafah. And this is after an Israeli strike on a tent camp full of Palestinians in Gaza, triggering global condemnation. There are questions certainly about the nature of that, and they admitted to striking a tent camp full of displaced Palestinians in Gaza. That was on Sunday night. Dozens were killed, and 2 terrorists as well, but there was certainly a death toll of about 45, according to some reports, triggering calls from many global leaders and senior Israeli officials for an end to the fighting. We've also had one Israeli soldier saying that there should be a mutiny as well. It's clearly a very serious situation, and it has been for many, many months since the Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October, which kicked all this off. Sean Bell is a retired Air Vice Marshal and military analyst. Sean, what do you make of the latest news coming out of Israel? Is there any hope whatsoever for any sort of breakthrough, or are we just dealing with more and more violence and death?
Yeah, good evening, Peter. I was with colleagues today, and there were some people there who were hopeful that when the IDF were planning an announcement, I think for about 2 o'clock this afternoon, that something more positive would come out, potentially with a view to end of hostilities. But in fact, all it was, as you say, after that tragic attack on Sunday, Netanyahu described as a tragic mistake. But we heard Daniel Hagari earlier on today at that news conference claim that actually it was Israel had only used 2 small munitions, but they claim that one of the things they struck at the Hamas headquarters was a weapons supply, and their weapons going off caused the devastation we saw on the ground. Unfortunately, whilst that may or may not be true, it doesn't mitigate against the actions of the Israelis, because they should have done a risk mitigation exercise. They have a legal obligation to minimize the number of civilian casualties. And of course, this comes after the international community has been saying, don't go into Rafah. You've got to clear the area of civilians. But it seems Netanyahu is determined to finish the job.
Is it possible to actually do what the international community want to do and clear the area of civilians? Because what Hamas terrorists often do is use their own people as essentially, and I hate using the phrase because it dehumanizes people, but they are essentially human shields. It is interesting that the 45 people killed, according to those figures are according to Hamas, so we need to be sceptical about them. But in a statement on Monday, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the strike had killed scores of innocent civilians who were only seeking shelter from this deadly conflict. There is no safe place in Gaza. This horror must stop. But Netanyahu has vowed to continue the war despite all this international condemnation, and indeed basically a legal ruling from the International Court of Justice as well, telling him to stop.
Yes, and I think we've got the slight conundrum here, haven't we? That the pressure's mounting on Netanyahu, but he seems firmly that if Hamas survives in any form, they will claim they've won. And Israel doesn't seem to want to countenance that. What is interesting, I think, is that rather than stopping and pausing, which you'd imagine with the international condemnation, as you say, the International Court of Justice has said don't go in. President Biden has said don't go in. But actually, Netanyahu seems to be absolutely committed, and he seems to be pushing even harder at the moment. Reports today that there were tanks in the middle of Rafah, that actually they moved into the Philadelphia line, which is that border between Egypt and Gaza, the one border that Israel didn't control. There's a lot of rumors that underneath that border tunnel network that was allowing Hamas to get them more arms to them. It does feel that Netanyahu is going to continue to the bitter end. The trouble is, and I've said this to you before, you've heard me say it, there is no military solution to the problem there, even when Netanyahu's been through the Rafah region. They've been through regions in the north and the central Gaza 2 or 3 times, and Hamas keep popping out of the tunnels. That Gaza network, 500 kilometers of network, they clearly have the means, they clearly have the will. The only way this will be solved is a political solution, and unfortunately the 2 sides are never going to be able to sit around a table. That's going to have to involve the international community.
The Israeli side would say that actually you can't put out a bit of a fire. You've got to completely eradicate Hamas terrorists. You've got to completely eradicate that. I mean, is that in any way possible, do you think, given the clear difficulties they're having and the huge humanitarian toll of this? Even Netanyahu himself, I mean, Hamas have much higher figures. The UN figure is somewhere in the middle, and they have changed those figures. But even Netanyahu says that 16,000 innocent civilians in Gaza have died as a result of Israeli airstrikes.
Yeah, it is worth. I mean, the figures, as you say, Peter. I mean, what's been interesting over the many decades of this various conflict, the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority figures have subsequently turned out to be pretty close to correct. And whilst you're quite right
but the UN doesn't think that this time, and Netanyahu doesn't think so either. I just want to give the full picture. I mean, the UN questions those as well from Hamas. But sorry, it's just a side point. Sean, do continue.
Yeah, no, it was more, Peter. You're right to question it, but it is interesting. The International Committee of the Red Cross also said they were dealing with massive numbers of casualties. So it's quite clear a lot of civilians have been badly injured and killed in this. Your core question, though, is can Hamas be killed? And you only have to look at some of the pictures coming out from Gaza. The young children who have seen their families devastated. They will have a legacy that will be imprinted on their DNA. We're building a generation of people who will never forgive, never forget. It's visceral hatred. And whilst you've got one Hamas fighter standing, the ideal will still be there. And it's therefore, I think it's purely idealistic to say that you'll be able to destroy Hamas. You can pretty much guarantee the day that Israel says they prevail, the very next morning, Hamas will fire some rockets across into Israeli territory. You know, there has to be a diplomatic solution because ultimately, depending on whatever side you are, humanity, it's all about creating the opportunity where Hamas and, well, Palestinians have hope that they have a commercial future and they have some sort of territory in that two-state solution. And bluntly, until that can be negotiated, that we're going to see this continued friction and it's not going to be solved.
Sean, thank you very much indeed. Sean Bell, retired Air Vice Marshal and military analyst.